The will was clear as mountain water. Clara Morrison inherited every acre, every head of cattle, and every building on the 10,000-acre Morrison Ranch when her father died of a heart attack on March 15, 1883. But as Clara stood in the lawyer's office in Cattle Creek, Montana Territory, listening to the reading of her father's will, she could see the doubt and skepticism in the eyes of every rancher, banker, and businessman in the room. A 24-year-old woman, inheriting one of the largest cattle operations in 3 territories, was unprecedented, and the men who controlled the region's economy had no intention of allowing precedent to become reality. What they didn't know was that Daniel Morrison had spent 20 years preparing his daughter for this moment, teaching her everything about running a ranch that the other cattle barons had assumed no woman could ever learn. Clara Morrison wasn't just inheriting land and livestock. She was inheriting a war that had been building for decades, and she was about to prove that the most dangerous rancher in Montana Territory was the one nobody had bothered to take seriously. To understand how Clara Morrison became the woman who changed cattle ranching forever, you need to know about the promise she made to her dying father and the empire he had built for her to defend against men who believed that women belonged in kitchens, not in boardrooms. It was September 12, 1863, when Daniel Morrison first homesteaded in the Yellowstone River Valley, claiming 160 acres under the Homestead Act and beginning what would become one of the most successful ranching operations in the American West. Daniel was an Irishman who had fled the potato famine as a child, and he understood that land ownership was the only real security in an uncertain world. Over the next 20 years, Daniel expanded his holdings through a combination of additional homestead claims, strategic purchases, and careful negotiation with neighboring ranchers. By 1883, the Morrison Ranch encompassed 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, supported 5,000 head of cattle, and employed 37 cowboys, making it the 3rd largest ranch in Montana Territory. But Daniel Morrison's greatest innovation wasn't in land acquisition or cattle breeding. It was in how he raised his daughter. Clara's mother, Catherine, had died when Clara was 6 years old, leaving Daniel to raise his daughter alone on the frontier. Instead of sending Clara back east to be educated as a proper lady, Daniel made a revolutionary decision. He would teach her to run the ranch. From the age of 7, Clara accompanied her father on every aspect of ranch management. She learned to read cattle brands, evaluate grazing land, negotiate with cattle buyers, manage seasonal workers, and handle the complex financial arrangements that kept a large ranching operation profitable. By the time she was 15, Clara could ride, rope, and shoot as well as any cowboy on the ranch. But Daniel's education of his daughter went beyond practical skills. He taught Clara the political and economic realities of the cattle business, helping her understand how territorial politics, railroad shipping rates, and eastern beef markets all affected their operation. Most importantly, he taught her that knowledge and competence were the only reliable forms of power. Men will try to tell you that ranching is too hard for a woman, Daniel told Clara during one of their conversations as they rode the fence line in 1880. They'll say you're too weak, too emotional, too inexperienced. Don't waste time arguing with them. Just know more than they do, work harder than they do, and make more money than they do. Results speak louder than arguments. By 1883, Clara Morrison was arguably the most knowledgeable cattle rancher in Montana Territory, male or female. She understood every aspect of the business, from grass management to market speculation. What she lacked was the legal authority to implement her knowledge, and that authority would only come through inheritance. Daniel Morrison's sudden death from a heart attack was a shock to everyone, including Clara. At 57, Daniel had seemed healthy and vigorous, with plans to expand the ranch even further. His death left Clara not just bereaved, but facing the immediate challenge of proving she could manage the inheritance that every other rancher in the territory assumed she would quickly lose. The challenge came in the form of an offer from James Whitman, the owner of the largest ranch in Montana Territory, and the unofficial leader of the Regional Cattle Barons Association. 3 days after Daniel's funeral, Whitman appeared at the Morrison Ranch with a proposal that he clearly expected Clara to accept gratefully. "Miss Morrison," Whitman said as they sat in the ranch house parlor, "I know this is a difficult time for you, but I want to help. The Morrison Ranch is too large and complex for a young woman to manage alone. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous price for the entire operation. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life without the burden of running a cattle business." Clara studied Whitman's face, recognizing the condescension behind his apparent generosity. "Mr. Whitman, I appreciate your concern, but I have no intention of selling the ranch. My father built this operation for me to inherit and manage, and that's exactly what I plan to do." Whitman's expression shifted from patronizing sympathy to barely concealed irritation. "Clara, be realistic. You have no experience running a business this size. You don't understand the financial complexities, the market pressures, the political considerations. You'll lose everything within a year, and then you'll have nothing. I understand more about this ranch than you understand about yours," Clara replied calmly. "I know every section of grazing land, every water source, every market connection, and every financial obligation. I also know exactly how much profit this ranch generates, and it's considerably more than what you're offering to pay for it." The meeting ended with Whitman's departure, and Clara's clear understanding that she had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. But what she didn't yet realize was that Whitman's offer had been the polite attempt at acquisition. The serious pressure was about to begin. Within a week of her refusal to sell, Clara began experiencing what could only be described as a coordinated campaign to force her out of the cattle business. Her access to railroad shipping was mysteriously delayed due to scheduling conflicts. Suppliers who had done business with the Morrison Ranch for years suddenly demanded payment in advance instead of extending the credit terms they had always offered. Most seriously, several of her most experienced cowboys were offered significantly higher wages to work for other ranches. The message was clear: the cattle barons would make it impossible for Clara to operate her ranch profitably, forcing her to sell at a substantial loss rather than face complete bankruptcy. Clara's response surprised everyone, including her own ranch foreman Tom Bradley, who had worked for Daniel Morrison for 15 years and genuinely cared about Clara's welfare. "Miss Clara," Bradley said during one of their planning meetings, "maybe you should consider Whitman's offer. These men have enough power to destroy this ranch, and there's no shame in recognizing when you're outgunned." Clara looked at Bradley with the same steady gaze her father had used when making difficult decisions. "Tom, my father didn't build this ranch so I could sell it to the first bully who threatened me. He built it so I could prove that women are just as capable of succeeding in business as men are. If I sell now, I'm not just giving up the ranch, I'm proving that every man who thinks women can't handle responsibility is right. But what can you do against men who control the railroads and the banks?" Bradley asked. "I can outthink them, outwork them, and outlast them," Clara replied. "And I can do something they can't do. I can change the rules of the game." What Clara meant by changing the rules became clear over the following months as she implemented a strategy that transformed how cattle ranching operated in Montana Territory. Instead of fighting the established system that the cattle barons controlled, Clara created an alternative system that bypassed their power entirely. First, she addressed the shipping problem by negotiating directly with railroad officials in Chicago rather than working through the local territorial agents who had been pressured to exclude her. Clara's knowledge of cattle markets and shipping logistics, combined with her willingness to guarantee large, consistent shipments, made her an attractive customer for railroad executives who cared more about profits than territorial politics. Second, Clara solved the supply problem by establishing direct relationships with manufacturers and wholesalers, cutting out the local middlemen who had been pressured to discriminate against her. Her business was large enough to make these direct relationships profitable for suppliers, and her reputation for prompt payment made her a preferred customer. Most importantly, Clara addressed the labor problem by creating working conditions and compensation packages that were superior to anything offered by other ranches in the territory. Instead of trying to match the higher wages that other ranchers were offering to steal her workers, Clara implemented profit-sharing arrangements that gave her cowboys a financial stake in the ranch's success. The profit-sharing system was revolutionary in the cattle business. Instead of treating cowboys as temporary hired hands, Clara made them partners in the ranch's profitability. Cowboys who stayed with the Morrison Ranch for a full year received bonuses based on the ranch's annual profits. Those who stayed for 3 years became eligible for land grants that allowed them to establish their own small ranching operations on Morrison Ranch territory. The results were immediate and dramatic. Not only did Clara retain her existing workforce, but she began attracting the best cowboys from other ranches, including some who left higher-paying positions to work for the Morrison Ranch because of the long-term opportunities Clara offered. By late 1883, the Morrison Ranch was not only surviving the pressure campaign against it, but actually expanding its operations and increasing its profitability. Clara's innovations were making her ranch more efficient and more profitable than the traditional operations run by the cattle barons who had tried to force her out of business. The success of Clara's alternative approach began to attract attention from other ranchers, particularly smaller operators who had also faced pressure from the Cattle Barons Association. Clara's willingness to share her innovations and her success in breaking the monopolistic practices of the established ranchers made her a natural leader for ranchers who wanted alternatives to the existing power structure. By 1884, Clara had organized the Independent Cattlemen's Association, a coalition of smaller ranchers who adopted her business practices and worked together to challenge the dominance of the large cattle barons. The association provided its members with collective bargaining power for shipping and supplies, shared access to Clara's market connections, and mutual support against the economic pressure tactics that had been used to control the territory's cattle business. The formation of the Independent Cattlemen's Association marked the beginning of what became known as the Montana Range War, a conflict that would determine whether the territory's cattle business would be controlled by a small group of powerful men, or open to competition from ranchers who were willing to innovate and change. The war wasn't fought with guns, though there were occasional incidents of violence. Instead, it was fought through economic competition, political maneuvering, and legal challenges. Clara found herself at the center of this conflict, not just as a participant, but as the leader of the faction that was challenging the established order. The cattle barons' response to Clara's success was swift and comprehensive. James Whitman organized a boycott of any business that dealt with the Independent Cattlemen's Association. Banks were pressured to call in loans held by association members. Political pressure was applied to territorial officials to create regulations that would disadvantage smaller ranchers. But Clara had anticipated this escalation and prepared for it. Her legal education, acquired through correspondence courses and consultation with lawyers in Chicago and New York, allowed her to challenge discriminatory regulations in territorial courts. Her financial management skills helped association members restructure their operations to weather economic pressure. Most importantly, her success in developing alternative business relationships provided the association with options that the cattle barons couldn't control. The turning point in the Range War came in 1885, when Clara Morrison was invited to testify before a congressional committee investigating monopolistic practices in territorial businesses. Her testimony, which detailed the systematic attempts to exclude smaller ranchers from the cattle business, resulted in federal antitrust action against the Cattle Barons Association and significant changes in how territorial business regulation was conducted. Clara's congressional testimony was unprecedented. She was the first woman ever to testify before Congress about business practices in the Western Territories. Her knowledge, competence, and clear articulation of complex economic issues impressed lawmakers and helped establish her as a national authority on cattle ranching and territorial economic development. The federal intervention that resulted from Clara's testimony broke the monopolistic control that the cattle barons had exercised over Montana Territory's economy. New regulations required that shipping, banking, and supply services be available to all qualified ranchers on equal terms. The Independent Cattlemen's Association's business practices were formally recognized as legitimate alternatives to traditional ranching methods. By 1886, Clara Morrison had not only saved her own ranch, but had transformed the entire cattle industry in Montana Territory. Her innovations in labor relations, marketing, and financial management had been adopted by ranchers throughout the region. Her leadership had created opportunities for smaller ranchers who had previously been excluded from the business. Most importantly, her success had proven that women could compete successfully in what had been considered an exclusively male profession. The long-term impact of Clara's victory extended far beyond cattle ranching. Her success inspired women throughout the Western Territories to challenge traditional restrictions on female participation in business and politics. Her business innovations influenced the development of modern labor relations and cooperative marketing practices. Her political activism helped establish legal precedents for challenging monopolistic business practices. Clara Morrison continued to run the Morrison Ranch until her death in 1923, 40 years after inheriting it from her father. Under her management, the ranch expanded to 15,000 acres and became one of the most profitable and innovative cattle operations in the American West. Her profit-sharing system and cooperative marketing practices became standard throughout the region. But perhaps more importantly, Clara's success changed how the Western Territories approached questions of gender, business ownership, and economic opportunity. Her example proved that competence rather than gender should determine who could participate in business leadership, and her innovations showed that challenging established practices could benefit entire industries. The Clara Morrison School of Business, established at the University of Montana in 1925, continues to teach the management and leadership principles that Clara developed during her 40-year career as a rancher. The school's motto, taken from Clara's own words, captures the essence of her philosophy. Competence speaks louder than prejudice, and results matter more than assumptions. Today, the Morrison Ranch is preserved as a National Historic Site, recognizing both its significance in the development of the American cattle industry and its role in advancing women's participation in business leadership. Visitors to the ranch can see the original buildings where Clara lived and worked, read her correspondence with other business leaders, and learn about the innovations she developed that transformed cattle ranching. The story of the rancher's daughter's inheritance serves as a powerful reminder that progress often comes from those who are underestimated by the established power structure. Clara Morrison's success wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a demonstration that talent, knowledge, and determination can overcome prejudice and create opportunities for entire communities. Her legacy reminds us that the most significant changes in how societies operate often come from individuals who refuse to accept limitations that others assume are permanent. Clara Morrison inherited a ranch, but she created a revolution that expanded opportunities for everyone who had been told they didn't belong in positions of leadership and responsibility. The ripple effects of Clara Morrison's success extended far beyond Montana Territory, influencing women's rights movements and business practices throughout the American West and beyond. Her story became a rallying point for suffragettes, arguing that women's competence in business proved their readiness for political participation, and her business innovations were studied by economists and labor organizers, seeking models for more equitable economic systems. Dr. Susan Anthony, the prominent women's rights advocate, visited the Morrison Ranch in 1887, and later wrote extensively about Clara's achievements in the Revolution, her influential newspaper dedicated to women's suffrage. Anthony's articles about Clara reached audiences throughout the United States and helped establish Clara as a national symbol of women's capabilities in leadership roles. Miss Morrison has accomplished what no amount of theoretical argument could achieve, Anthony wrote. She has demonstrated through practical success that women possess every qualification necessary for business leadership and economic responsibility. Her example renders obsolete every argument against women's participation in public affairs. The publicity from Anthony's articles attracted visitors from around the world to the Morrison Ranch, including journalists, politicians, business leaders, and social reformers who wanted to observe Clara's methods firsthand. These visits resulted in numerous publications and speeches that spread awareness of Clara's innovations far beyond the cattle industry. One of the most influential visitors was Jane Addams, the social reformer who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in establishing settlement houses and promoting social justice. Addams spent 2 weeks at the Morrison Ranch in 1888, studying Clara's profit-sharing system and cooperative management practices. What Miss Morrison has created represents a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between capital and labor. Addams wrote in her subsequent book, Democracy and Social Ethics. Her workers are not merely employees but partners in a shared enterprise, creating economic relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Addams' analysis of Clara's labor practices influenced the development of progressive management theories and helped establish intellectual foundations for the labor reform movements of the early 20th century. The profit-sharing and worker participation systems that Clara had developed for practical reasons became models for addressing economic inequality throughout American industry. The international attention that Clara's work received also influenced women's rights movements in other countries. European suffragettes cited Clara's success as evidence that women could manage complex economic enterprises, while feminist writers used her story to challenge traditional assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. By 1890, Clara Morrison had become sufficiently famous that she was invited to speak at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where she addressed an audience of more than 10,000 people about women's role in economic development. Her speech, titled "The Future of American Business," argued that excluding women from leadership positions was not just unfair to women but economically harmful to society as a whole. Every nation that artificially limits its pool of potential leaders to half its population is choosing to operate at half its capacity, Clara told the exposition audience. The question is not whether women are capable of business leadership. The question is whether societies are wise enough to utilize all their available talent. The exposition speech was reprinted in newspapers throughout the United States and translated into several foreign languages, establishing Clara as an international authority on women's economic participation. Her arguments influenced policy discussions about women's rights in numerous countries and helped build support for women's suffrage movements worldwide. But Clara's influence extended beyond advocacy for women's rights to practical innovations that transformed business practices throughout the American economy. Her profit-sharing systems were adopted by companies in dozens of industries, while her cooperative marketing approaches influenced the development of agricultural cooperatives that helped small farmers compete with large corporations. The Independent Cattlemen's Association that Clara had founded grew into a regional organization with more than 500 members by 1895, and its practices influenced the formation of similar cooperatives in other territories and states. The association's success demonstrated that smaller businesses could compete effectively with large corporations when they worked together strategically. Clara's political influence also grew significantly during the 1890s. She served as an advisor to territorial governors on economic development issues and was consulted by federal officials about policies affecting Western agriculture and business. Her expertise was particularly valued because she understood both the practical challenges of running businesses and the broader economic forces that affected entire regions. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Clara was among the advisors who helped draft the new state's constitution, particularly the sections dealing with business regulation and workers' rights. Her influence helped ensure that Montana's constitution included strong protections for economic competition and worker participation in business decision-making. The constitutional provisions that Clara helped develop became models for other states and influenced federal legislation about monopolistic business practices and workers' rights. Her legal expertise, developed through years of challenging discriminatory business practices, proved invaluable in creating laws that promoted economic fairness and opportunity. During the 1890s, Clara also became involved in education, helping to establish business programs at the University of Montana and other institutions throughout the region. She believed that widespread business education was essential for creating economic opportunities for people who had traditionally been excluded from business leadership. The curriculum that Clara developed emphasized practical management skills, cooperative business practices, and ethical leadership principles. Her courses were among the first in American higher education to include substantial content about women's roles in business and the importance of diversity in organizational leadership. Students from Clara's programs went on to establish successful businesses throughout the West, many of them implementing the profit-sharing and cooperative practices that Clara had pioneered. These businesses became models for other entrepreneurs and helped spread Clara's innovations throughout the regional economy. Clara's educational work also extended to developing training programs for ranch workers and farmers who wanted to start their own operations. Her graduation to ownership program helped dozens of cowboys and farm workers transition from employees to independent business owners, creating economic opportunities that had previously been unavailable to working-class people. The program was so successful that it was adopted by other large ranches and farms throughout the region, helping to create a more diverse and competitive agricultural economy. Clara's belief that business ownership should be accessible to anyone willing to work for it became a defining characteristic of Montana's economic development. By 1900, Clara Morrison had transformed not just her own ranch, but the entire economic and social structure of Montana and surrounding territories. Her innovations had created opportunities for thousands of people who had previously been excluded from business ownership, while her advocacy had helped advance women's rights throughout the United States. The Morrison Ranch itself had become a destination for people seeking to learn about innovative business practices, progressive labor relations, and women's leadership. The ranch's success demonstrated that businesses could be both profitable and socially responsible, creating value for owners, workers, and communities simultaneously. When Clara Morrison died in 1923, her funeral was attended by more than 2,000 people, including business leaders, politicians, social reformers, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her work. The diversity of the mourners reflected the breadth of Clara's influence and the lasting impact of her contributions to American society. The eulogy was delivered by Jeanette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress, who credited Clara's example with inspiring her own entry into politics. Rankin's words captured the essence of Clara's legacy and its continuing relevance for future generations. Clara Morrison proved that leadership is not a privilege reserved for those who happen to be born into positions of advantage, Rankin said. Leadership is a responsibility that belongs to anyone with the knowledge, courage, and commitment to make their communities better. She showed us that breaking barriers is not just about individual achievement, it's about creating opportunities for everyone who comes after. Today, the Clara Morrison Institute for Women's Leadership continues to train women for business and political leadership roles, while the Morrison Ranch serves as a living laboratory for sustainable agriculture and cooperative business practices. Her innovations continue to influence how modern businesses approach worker participation, profit sharing, and community responsibility. The story of the rancher's daughter's inheritance reminds us that true leadership often emerges from those who are underestimated by existing power structures. Clara Morrison's success came not from accepting the limitations that others tried to impose on her, but from refusing to believe that those limitations were permanent or justified. Her approach to challenging discrimination and monopolistic practices became a template that was studied and applied in numerous other contexts throughout American history. Civil rights leaders in the 20th century examined Clara's methods for building coalitions, developing alternative economic systems, and using legal challenges to overcome systematic exclusion. The techniques that Clara developed for organizing the Independent Cattlemen's Association influenced the formation of labor unions, civil rights organizations, and other groups that sought to challenge entrenched power structures. Her emphasis on economic cooperation, collective bargaining, and mutual support became foundational principles for progressive organizing throughout the 20th century. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, referenced Clara Morrison's example as evidence that economic justice and social justice were inseparable goals. Miss Morrison understood that equality without economic opportunity is merely theoretical, King wrote. Her success in creating alternatives to exclusionary systems provides a model for how oppressed communities can build power through cooperation and innovation. The connection between Clara's work and later civil rights movements wasn't merely theoretical. Many of the cooperative economic practices that she had pioneered were adopted by African American communities in the South during the 1950s and 1960s, helping to create economic independence that supported political organizing and social change. Similarly, the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s drew extensively on Clara's example and methods. Feminist organizers studied her approach to challenging gender discrimination, her strategies for building alternative institutions, and her success in proving that women could compete successfully in traditionally male-dominated fields. Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique and founder of the National Organization for Women, wrote extensively about Clara Morrison's influence on her own thinking about women's economic rights. Clara Morrison proved that the personal is political, Friedan wrote. Her success in business wasn't just individual achievement, it was a political statement about women's capabilities and society's obligations to provide equal opportunities. The business innovations that Clara developed also continued to influence corporate practices well into the 21st century. Her profit-sharing systems became models for employee stock ownership plans. Her cooperative marketing approaches influenced the development of modern supply chain management, and her emphasis on worker participation in decision-making anticipated many aspects of contemporary management theory. Modern business schools continue to study Clara's methods as examples of how innovative leadership can transform entire industries. Her approach to stakeholder capitalism, the idea that businesses should serve the interests of workers, communities, and society as well as owners, anticipated by more than a century the corporate responsibility movements of the 21st century. The Morrison Ranch itself became a laboratory for sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. Clara's emphasis on working with natural systems rather than fighting against them influenced the development of modern ecological farming practices and helped establish principles that are now considered fundamental to sustainable agriculture. Environmental historians credit Clara with developing some of the earliest examples of holistic land management, integrating cattle grazing with wildlife habitat preservation, water conservation, and soil health maintenance. Her methods proved that profitable agriculture and environmental sustainability were compatible goals rather than competing priorities. Today, the Morrison Ranch continues to operate as a working demonstration of sustainable agriculture, organic cattle ranching, and renewable energy production. The ranch's success proves that Clara's vision of economic prosperity through environmental stewardship remains viable and profitable more than a century after she first implemented these practices. The Clara Morrison Foundation, established in 1950, continues to provide grants and support for women entrepreneurs, sustainable agriculture projects, and cooperative business development worldwide. The Foundation's work has helped establish similar enterprises in more than 40 countries, spreading Clara's innovations to agricultural communities facing challenges similar to those she encountered in Montana Territory. Through all these continuing influences and applications, Clara Morrison's legacy demonstrates that individual courage and innovation can create changes that resonate across generations and inspire progress in circumstances far different from those that originally called forth that courage. Her refusal to accept that women belonged in kitchens rather than boardrooms opened possibilities not just for herself but for countless others who found in her example the inspiration to challenge their own limitations and create their own opportunities for leadership and success.